I told the alien woman in her own language, "Your eyes are very beautiful," and her reaction was incredible. Dylan had been staring at the same requisition form for 20 minutes, watching the Ethera script swim across his tablet like confused eels. When he decided that if he didn't get out of his quarters, he might actually start a conversation with the air recycler. It had been making a sympathetic wheezing sound lately that felt almost like companionship. The station kept time by something called Universal Coordinated Cycle, which meant absolutely nothing to Dylan's circadian rhythm. His body insisted it was 3 in the morning. The station cheerfully informed him it was 1400 hours. Compromise seemed impossible, so he'd stop sleeping at reasonable times altogether. He wandered through the curved corridors of Kepler Station, past the sealed doors of delegates who were probably enjoying normal sleep schedules, past the communal areas that looked depressing when empty, until he found himself at the observation deck. It was his favorite kind of empty, the kind where you could pretend you were the only human in the galaxy without it being technically true. The nebula sprawled across the viewport like someone had spilled an entire art supply store into space. Purples and golds swirled together in slow motion, backlit by stars that had died before Earth learned to grow wheat. Dylan had seen it dozens of times, but it still made him feel pleasantly insignificant. Then he noticed he wasn't alone. She stood at the far end of the viewport, silhouetted against the cosmic light show, and for a moment Dylan's brain stuttered over the simple geometry of her. Tall, slim, with hair that seemed to drink in the starlight rather than reflect it. Then she turned slightly and he caught the elegant sweep of her ears rising through that dark hair, the pale luminescence of her skin. Ethera. His heart did something complicated and unnecessary. He'd seen Ethera before. 3 of them worked on the station, gliding through meetings with the kind of grace that made everyone else look like they were walking through soup. But he'd never seen one alone, unguarded, just existing in a quiet moment. Her eyes caught the nebula light, and they were extraordinary. Silver, but not flat silver. Living silver like Mercury given sentience, swirling with depths he couldn't name. The Ethera phrase bubbled up from months of study, from late nights parsing poetry that sang even when he butchered the pronunciation. It fell out of his mouth with careful, practiced musicality. "Your eyes are very beautiful." The words hung in the air, like he'd just thrown something fragile. She went absolutely still. Then she turned, fully turned, and those remarkable eyes went wide. Her lips parted in what might have been shock or possibly the prelude to calling security. Dylan's brain finally caught up with his mouth and began screaming helpful warnings about cultural sensitivity and appropriate workplace behavior. The silence stretched. Somewhere in the station's guts, something beeped. A recycling system cycled. Dylan contemplated whether the escape pods were clearly marked. "You speak the old dialect," she said finally, in standard that carried the musical lilt of her native tongue. Her voice sounded strained, careful, like she was testing each word for stability. "Where did you learn that particular phrasing?" Dylan's mind raced through every Ethera lesson he'd stumbled through, trying to figure out if he'd accidentally propositioned her or insulted her ancestors or somehow declared war. The language files he'd used were old, pulled from the station's archive, because the commercial learning programs were absolutely terrible at capturing the poetry. "I've been studying Ethera," he managed, which seemed like a safer answer than, "I have no idea what I just said, but your face suggests it wasn't great." She took a step toward him. Her hands moved to clasp at her waist in a gesture that looked formal, controlled, like she was physically holding herself together. "Do you understand what you said to me?" "I complimented your eyes," Dylan offered, his voice lilting up into a question. "In your language?" Which seemed polite at the time, but I'm rapidly reconsidering that assessment. A sound escaped her, half laugh, half something else entirely. Her expression flickered through surprise, confusion, and landed on something that might have been amusement, but could just as easily have been the prelude to a formal complaint. "Among my people," she said slowly, "we don't speak casually of eyes." "Right," Dylan said. That's good information to have now." But she was smiling, actually smiling, soft and genuine, and Dylan felt the panic in his chest start to unknot itself. "I'm Ellie," she said. "Dylan," he replied, Professional cultural disaster, apparently. Her laugh was musical and bright, and it echoed beautifully in the empty observation deck. Ellie moved closer, and Dylan noticed details he'd missed from across the deck. The faint pattern of light that moved beneath her skin, like bioluminescent currents. The way her ears twitched slightly when she was thinking. The silver of her eyes shifting in slow spirals that reminded him of nebulae in miniature. She stopped just close enough for conversation, far enough that he didn't feel like he was being inspected by customs. "So," she said, tilting her head in a way that made the observation deck's ambient lighting catch on those remarkable ears. "You've been studying the old dialect specifically, or did you just stumble into the most intimate grammar structure by accident?" Dylan felt heat creep up his neck. "I'm going to go with stumbled, and hope that makes this less mortifying." "It doesn't," Ellie said, but she was still smiling. "Commenting on someone's eyes in Ethera isn't like saying nice shoes in Standard. It's what we say to family members, to bonded partners, to people we trust with our lives. You essentially just told me you can see my soul and find it beautiful." "Ah," Dylan said weakly. "So on a scale of minor faux pas to interstellar incident, where are we landing?" "Somewhere around deeply confusing, but potentially charming." She studied him with those dangerous eyes, and Dylan tried very hard not to think about souls or beauty, or the fact that his language lessons had apparently skipped the chapter titled, "How Not to Accidentally Propose Marriage Through Compliments." "I'm trying to figure out if you're brave or just catastrophically uninformed." "I contain multitudes," Dylan said, "mostly catastrophic ones." That earned him another laugh, and he felt absurdly proud of himself. She leaned against the viewport railing, her posture relaxing from its initial tension. The nebula behind her shifted through a slow gradient of colors, purple bleeding into gold, gold into deep rose, and her skin seemed to pulse with reflected light. "You said you've been studying Ethera," she prompted. "Why? We have translators on every deck. Universal protocol requires them." "The translators are terrible," Dylan said honestly. "I tried reading Ethera poetry through the standard interface, and it came out sounding like an appliance manual. The dual sunset spreads across the lunar surface. Please see Appendix B for technical specifications." Ellie's eyes widened with what looked like genuine delight. "You read our poetry." "Serena of the Western Rings," Dylan said. "The collection about the third moon. I found a data file in the station archives, old colony records from the first contact missions. Took me 3 months to get through the first piece because I kept having to cross-reference every other word, but it was worth it." She went very quiet, and Dylan worried he'd somehow messed up again, claimed intimate knowledge of something he shouldn't have touched. But when he looked at her face, she seemed stunned in a good way, if there was such a thing. "That's my favorite," she said softly. "I've been on this station for 4 months, and no one has even heard of her. The other delegates think I'm strange for carrying a book of physical poetry when everything's supposed to be digital and efficient. The Trilaxian ambassador tried to tell me that physical books were inefficient yesterday," Dylan offered. "This was right before he attempted to drink coffee through his filtration gills and had to be rushed to medical. So I'm not sure he's an authority on efficiency." Ellie laughed again, and Dylan was beginning to think he might be addicted to that sound. "I heard about that. Apparently he's demanding a formal apology from caffeine itself." "He's going to be waiting a while," Dylan said. "Caffeine doesn't respond to diplomatic channels. Trust me, I've tried." They stood together at the viewport, and Dylan felt the strangeness of the moment settle into something comfortable. The station hummed around them, life support and gravity generators, and all the invisible technology that kept them alive in the void. Beyond the transparent aluminum, the nebula continued its ancient slow dance, indifferent to humans in Ethera and confused Trilaxians alike. "Can I ask you something?" Ellie said, her voice careful again. "When you said what you said about my eyes, did you mean it? Or was it just practice? Testing out phrases you'd learned?" Dylan considered lying, or deflecting, or making another joke to diffuse the weight of the question. But she was looking at him with those galaxy eyes, and he found he didn't want to. "I meant it," he said quietly. "I didn't understand what I was saying in your cultural context, but I meant the words themselves. You were standing there with the nebula light in your eyes, and you looked like something out of those poems I'd been reading. I spoke without thinking, which is apparently my superpower. Ellie was quiet for a long moment, her expression cycling through something complex. Then she smiled, smaller than before, but somehow more real. Good, she said, because according to Ethera custom, now that you've acknowledged my soul, I'm allowed to acknowledge yours. So here it is. You're lonely, you hide it with humor, and you learned an entire language just to read poetry properly. I think that's beautiful. Dylan's throat felt tight. That's not fair. You can't just be emotionally perceptive and devastating. I absolutely can, Ellie said. I'm Ethera. We invented emotionally perceptive and devastating. They drifted along the viewport without discussion, a natural migration toward the observation deck's far end, where the nebulous colors concentrated into something that looked like a cosmic bruise. Deep purple shot through with veins of amber. The silence between them felt different now, less awkward and more like two people learning the rhythm of each other's breathing. So what brought you here? Dylan asked, gesturing vaguely at the station around them. Besides the obvious appeal of endless diplomatic meetings and questionable food synthesizers. Ellie made a sound that might have been a sigh or possibly a suppressed scream. I was supposed to be part of a cultural exchange program. Grand visions of bridging species, fostering understanding, making history. Instead, I spend 6 hours a day in conference room 7B explaining why my people can't just hand over our bioluminescent technology in exchange for the Kandorian delegation's collection of ceremonial drums. Why can't you? Dylan asked, then immediately added, not that I'm advocating for the drums. I heard them practicing last week and it sounded like someone was murdering a percussion section. Our bioluminescence isn't technology, Ellie said, holding up her hand and concentrating. The light beneath her skin intensified, tracing patterns that looked like circuit boards designed by artists. It's biological, genetic, part of us. Asking us to trade it would be like asking humans to trade their ability to grow hair. Sure, we could explain the science, but that doesn't mean you could just download it into drums and hope for the best. The Kandorians are very optimistic people, Dylan said. Last month, they tried to convince the station administrator that their drums could improve the gravity generators through harmonic resonance. We had to make up a regulation about musical instruments near critical systems. I heard about that, Ellie said, her eyes sparkling with amusement. Wasn't there an incident with a tuba? We don't talk about the tuba incident, Dylan said seriously. It's classified. People lost their security clearances. The tuba is currently in an evidence locker on Titan, and we're all safer for it. Ellie laughed so hard she had to brace herself against the railing. Dylan watched the light pulse through her skin in waves, wondered if it was tied to emotion or if she was consciously controlling it. He wanted to ask, but wasn't sure if that fell under polite scientific curiosity or uncomfortably personal question to ask someone you met 10 minutes ago. What about you? Ellie asked when she'd recovered. What's your grand purpose on Kepler Station? Resource allocation coordinator, Dylan said in his best official voice, which sounds important until you realize it means I forward data packets between departments and make sure nobody tries to reroute life support to power their coffee maker. That sounds incredibly specific. It happened once, Dylan said. Engineering got creative during a double shift. We had to implement a station-wide policy. There's now a regulation that explicitly states you cannot sacrifice oxygen for caffeine, no matter how urgent the deadline. Humans are terrifying, Ellie said, but she was smiling. You'll sacrifice anything for stimulants. Says the species that literally glows, Dylan countered. What's that about? Is it just aesthetic, or does it serve a function? I've been wondering since I got here, but asking seemed rude. Ellie's ears twitched. That small motion he was learning to recognize as thought in progress. It's communication partially, emotional state, health status, complex ideas that don't translate well to spoken language. And partially it's just how we evolved. Our homeworld has a binary star system with irregular day cycles. We needed to see each other in the dark. That's actually beautiful, Dylan said. The translator just told me it was dermal photonic emission for practical purposes. And I assumed you were all just really committed to interior lighting. Well, we are also committed to interior lighting, Ellie admitted. But there's more to it than that. She paused, her expression shifting to something more serious. Can I ask you something? You said you've been here 7 months. I've seen you in the commissary. Always alone, always reading. You never talk to anyone. Why? Dylan felt the question land somewhere uncomfortable in his chest. I'm not great with people, he said carefully. Never have been. The job posting said, minimal social interaction required. And I thought that meant I'd be left alone to do my work. Turns out minimal is relative when you're on a station with 200 beings from 40 different species, all of whom have opinions about resource distribution. So you learned ether instead, Ellie said. It wasn't quite a question. Languages are easier than people, Dylan said. They have rules, grammar structures. If you study enough, you can predict how things work. People are just chaos with opposing thumbs. And yet you approached me, Ellie pointed out, spoke to me, risked chaos. Dylan looked at her, at the way the nebula light caught in her eyes and made them seem infinite. You look lonely too, he said quietly. Standing here by yourself, watching the stars. I recognized it. Ellie's bioluminescence flickered, a complex pattern that raced across her visible skin. You're very perceptive for someone who claims to be bad with people. I'm bad at talking to people, Dylan clarified. I'm excellent at observing them from a distance and drawing conclusions. It's the interaction part that gets messy. Well, Ellie said, and her smile was soft and complicated. How's this interaction going? Honestly, better than expected. I accidentally declared intimate feelings, learned I committed a cultural boundary violation, and somehow we're still talking. I'm calling that a win. The observation deck's environmental system kicked in with a gentle hiss, adjusting for what the station's AI considered optimal viewing conditions. The lighting dimmed by 3%, which Dylan only noticed because he'd spent enough sleepless nights here to memorize the cycle. Ellie turned back to the viewport, and they stood side by side now, close enough that he could see the subtle patterns in her bioluminescence. Not random at all, but structured, purposeful, like a language written in light. So, Ellie said, her voice carrying a note of calculated mischief, if you've been studying Ethera poetry, you must have encountered the food verses. Dylan groaned. The 17-stanza epic about fermented moonflower paste? Yes, I'm still not sure if it's meant to be reverent or satirical. It's both, Ellie said. That's what makes it brilliant. Though I should warn you that moonflower paste tastes exactly like you'd expect something called fermented moonflower paste to taste. Worse than the station's attempt at Ethera cuisine? Ellie's whole body shuddered, light rippling across her skin in what Dylan was pretty sure translated to visceral disgust. Last week I tried the synthesizer's version of traditional evening meal. It tasted like lavender mixed with regret and possibly a cleaning solution. I'm not convinced the machine understands that floral notes shouldn't be literal. The human option tastes like salt and existential disappointment, Dylan offered. I think the synthesizers are actively hostile. There's probably some rogue AI down in the kitchen systems, punishing us for our dietary hubris. I tried human food once, Ellie admitted. Something called a cheeseburger. The synthesizer asked me to specify cheese type, and I panicked and said, surprise me. Oh no. It surprised me with something blue and sentient adjacent. I'm fairly certain it was making eye contact. Dylan couldn't help it. He laughed hard enough that his voice echoed off the observation deck's curved ceiling. The synthesizers have a random setting for cheese and nobody knows why. Engineering claims it's a bug. I think it's psychological warfare. We should file a joint complaint, Ellie said. Unite our species against the true enemy, aggressive food synthesis technology. Finally, a diplomatic mission worth pursuing. They fell into comfortable silence again, watching the nebula shift through its cosmic dance. A small maintenance drone drifted past the external viewport, its tiny lights blinking in patterns that probably meant something to the station's central computer. Dylan had always found the drones oddly comforting, proof that even in the void, something was paying attention, keeping things running. Can I ask you something else? Ellie said, her tone shifting to something more curious than playful. The old dialect you've been learning, where did you find those files? Most of what's available in commercial databases is modern Ethera, streamlined for trade and diplomacy. But what you spoke was classical, the kind we use for poetry and formal ceremonies. Dylan felt slightly embarrassed, like he'd been caught doing something more intimate than intended. The station archives. There's a whole section from the first contact missions, 50 years ago. Someone named Dr. Chen spent 3 years on an Athera colony world, documenting everything. Language, customs, poetry, even recipes. It's all just sitting there in the database, barely indexed. I think I'm the first person to access it in a decade. Ellie went very still, her bioluminescence pulsing in a slow, steady rhythm. Dr. Amelia Chen. She studied on Arathis Prime, the northern continent. That's the one. You know her work? She's legendary among my people, Ellie said softly. One of the first humans to truly understand us, not just catalog us. She learned to read our light speech, participated in our ceremonies. When she left, the colony gave her a name in our language, Keeper of Understanding. We don't do that lightly. Dylan stared at the archive notation he'd seen dozens of times, suddenly understanding its weight. I had no idea. The files were just marked historical linguistic documentation. Very bureaucratic. Very boring. I only found them because I misspelled Ethera in the search function, and the system got creative. So you learned classical Ethera by accident, from the notes of a human who understood my people better than most Ethera do, and then you used it to accidentally tell me something profoundly intimate. Ellie's smile was brilliant, her eyes catching the light in ways that made Dylan's heart do complicated things. You're either the luckiest person on this station, or the universe has a very specific sense of humor. Can it be both? It's definitely both. She turned to face him fully, and Dylan noticed her hands had unclenched from their formal position, now hanging relaxed at her sides. Do you know what the traditional response is when someone acknowledges your soul in that way? I'm almost afraid to ask. You're supposed to offer to share starlight with them. Dylan's brain stuttered over the phrase, running through his mental vocabulary files. That's either having dinner together or declaring a blood oath, and I genuinely can't remember which. Ellie's laugh was musical and unrestrained. It means sharing a meal. The blood oath involves comparing heartbeats, and we definitely need more than one conversation before we get there. Dylan felt something warm unfold in his chest, something that had been knotted tight since he'd arrived at this station 7 months ago, feeling like an outsider in a place designed for connection. Sharing starlight sounds significantly better than comparing heartbeats, he said, though I should warn you that my heartbeat is probably irregular right now for reasons entirely related to accidentally committing cultural intimacy. Your honesty is refreshing, Ellie said. Most humans I've met on this station spend so much energy trying to be diplomatically correct that they forget to be actual people. You just stumbled in and said exactly what you were thinking. That's a generous interpretation. My supervisor would call it chronic failure to engage professional filter. Your supervisor sounds tedious. She's a Viridian efficiency specialist who measures productivity in 6 decimal places and considers bathroom breaks a sign of weak character. So yes, tedious is accurate. Ellie's bioluminescence flickered in a pattern that Dylan was learning to recognize as amusement. I have to sit through weekly cultural sensitivity briefings led by Ambassador Trell, who's convinced that all interspecies conflict can be resolved through structured breathing exercises and positive affirmations. Last week he tried to mediate a trade dispute between the Kandorians and the Zephyr Collective by having everyone hold hands and visualize cooperation. How did that go? The Zephyr representative doesn't have hands. She has sensory tendrils that excrete a mild paralytic when stressed. Ambassador Trell spent 3 hours in medical, getting feeling back in his fingers. Dylan tried to suppress his laugh and failed completely. This station is a disaster. It really is, Ellie agreed cheerfully. I think that's why I like it. Everyone's trying so hard to make this grand experiment work. All these species crammed into a station the size of a small city, pretending we understand each other. And mostly we just confuse each other in increasingly elaborate ways. The Trilaxian coffee incident wasn't elaborate, Dylan pointed out. That was just straightforward biological incompatibility. True, but the formal apology letter was 17 pages long and included a philosophical treatise on the nature of beverage-based suffering. That's elaborate. The nebula outside shifted again, and Dylan noticed a small ship passing through the field, probably a cargo transport, its navigation lights blinking a steady pattern as it maneuvered through the gravitational eddies. He'd watched dozens of ships pass through in his months here, each one a reminder that this station was just a waypoint, a temporary convergence of trajectories that would eventually scatter back to their origins. "Can I ask you something personal?" Dylan said, the words coming out before he could reconsider them. "You've already commented on my soul," Ellie said. "I think we're past the point of worrying about personal. Why are you really here? And I don't mean the official answer about cultural exchange. I mean, why did you volunteer for this? You could be home, with people who understand you, speaking your language, not having to explain bioluminescence to confused humans." Ellie was quiet for a long moment, her light pulsing in slow, contemplative patterns. "Same reason as you, probably. I wanted to be somewhere I wasn't expected to fit. On Arathis, everyone knows what I'm supposed to be. Daughter of the Eastern Council, trained in diplomatic protocols since I was old enough to control my light speech, destined for some important position, doing important things. Here I'm just another delegate in a station full of them. Nobody expects me to be exceptional. It's freeing." "That's exactly it," Dylan said, surprised by how much her answer resonated. "Everyone back on Earth had opinions about what I should do with my linguistics degree. Teach, translate, join some corporate communications team. Nobody understood that I just wanted to study language for its own sake, for the beauty of it. So I applied to the most remote posting I could find and ended up here, forwarding resource allocation reports and being magnificently mediocre." "We're both hiding," Ellie observed. "Aggressively," Dylan agreed. She smiled at that, and the warmth of it did something to the observation deck's atmosphere, made it feel less like a lonely viewing platform and more like a shared space, a small pocket of understanding carved out of the void. "So," Ellie said, her voice taking on that mischievous edge again, "about sharing starlight. The commissary is technically open for another hour, though calling what they serve food is generous. Or we could raid the emergency rations in Storage Bay 3. I happen to know they're not actually monitored after 2,200 hours. You're suggesting we steal emergency supplies. I'm suggesting we borrow culturally neutral nutrition packets that won't actively betray our taste buds. There's a difference. This is the most diplomatic way anyone's ever invited me to commit minor theft. I'm Ethera," Ellie said primly. "We make everything sound diplomatic. It's our superpower." They ended up in Storage Bay 3 minutes later, surrounded by crates of emergency rations and the gentle hum of preservation fields that kept everything in a state of perpetual, almost freshness. Ellie had been right about the monitoring. The security camera in the corner had a piece of maintenance tape over its lens, and someone had scrawled "broken, fix eventually" on the wall below it in 3 different languages. "This is very illicit," Dylan said, examining a ration pack labeled "nutritionally complete meal substitute. Flavor, optimistic. I feel like a rebel." "Wait until you taste it," Ellie said, tearing open her own pack. "Then you'll feel like a victim." They sat on a crate marked "Do Not Sit" in standard Ethera and what looked like Kandorian drum notation, their legs dangling, eating food that tasted like someone had explained flavor to an AI that had never experienced taste. Outside the small viewport, the nebula continued its endless performance, indifferent to their minor act of supply requisition. "You know what's strange?" Ellie said, chewing thoughtfully on something that claimed to be vegetable adjacent. "I've been on this station for 4 months, and this is the first real conversation I've had. Not a diplomatic briefing or a cultural exchange or a structured interaction. Just 2 people talking." "Same," Dylan admitted. "I convinced myself I was fine being alone. Told myself I came here to escape expectations, not to make connections. But I think I was just scared." "Of what?" "Of saying the wrong thing, of not fitting, of being the linguistic specialist who can parse dead languages but can't manage small talk without causing an interstellar incident." He paused, looking at her. "And then I did exactly that, said completely the wrong thing in exactly the wrong way, and somehow it turned out right anyway." Ellie's bioluminescence flared in a complex pattern, cascading across her skin in waves that Dylan was beginning to understand meant something like joy mixed with affection. "You know what I think? I think you said exactly the right thing. Maybe not in the way you intended, but sometimes accidents are just the universe correcting our overthinking. That's a very optimistic view of my social incompetence. I prefer to think of it as linguistic courage. She set down her ration pack and turned to face him fully, her silver eyes reflecting the distant nebula light. You studied an entire language just to read poetry properly. You approached a stranger and spoke from your heart without calculating the diplomatic ramifications. Do you know how rare that is? Everyone on this station is so busy being careful, being appropriate, following protocols. You just existed genuinely, and that's terrifying and beautiful. Dylan felt his throat tighten. I'm not used to people seeing me that way. Then people haven't been paying attention. Ellie reached out slowly, telegraphing the movement, and placed her hand over his. Her skin was warm, and the bioluminescence pulsed gently where they touched, a soft glow that felt like communication beyond words. Thank you for seeing my soul and saying so, even accidentally. Thank you for not reporting me to station security, Dylan said, trying to lighten the moment before emotion overwhelmed him entirely. I was genuinely worried for a minute there. I considered it, Ellie said seriously, but then I decided that anyone willing to learn classical Athara from 50-year-old archives just to read poetry deserved a chance at redemption. They sat in comfortable silence, eating terrible food in a storage bay they weren't supposed to be in, and Dylan felt something shift inside him, that tight, anxious knot he'd been carrying since Earth finally loosening. He'd spent so long trying to be invisible, trying not to need people, convinced that isolation was safer than risk. But Ellie was right. Sometimes accidents were just corrections, the universe shoving you towards something you were too scared to choose yourself. So, he said eventually, what happens now? Do we go back to being lonely delegates who pass each other in the corridors and pretend this conversation never happened? Or do we commit to this cosmic accident and see where it goes? Ellie's smile was brilliant, her eyes catching the light in ways that made his heart perform elaborate gymnastics. I think we've already committed. You acknowledged my soul. I invited you to steal emergency rations. By Athera standards, we're practically bonded for life. That's terrifying. It's supposed to be. She squeezed his hand gently, light pulsing beneath her skin. But maybe the terrifying things are the ones worth doing. Maybe that's what we're both here to learn. That connection is worth the risk of getting it wrong. Dylan looked at their joined hands, at the soft glow where her bioluminescence met his very human skin, at the nebula beyond the viewport painting the cosmos in impossible colors. 7 months ago, he'd arrived at this station expecting nothing, wanting nothing except to be left alone with his languages and his careful isolation. Now he was sitting in a storage bay with an alien woman whose soul he'd accidentally complimented, eating stolen rations and feeling more understood than he'd ever felt on Earth. Your eyes really are beautiful, though, he said quietly, in standard this time, meaning every word. I know what it means now, and I still mean it. Ellie met his gaze, silver eyes warm and infinite. I know, she said. That's why I smiled. The end. We've reached the end of Dylan and Ellie's story, where they discovered that sometimes the most meaningful connections are made when we stop trying to be perfect and dare to be honest. In a universe filled with careful protocols and diplomatic distances, they found each other by accident, a beautiful, terrifying accident that changed everything. But there's something to consider. How many times have we held back from reaching out to someone because we were afraid of saying the wrong thing? How often do we choose safe isolation over the risk of making a real connection? Dylan could have stayed silent on that observation deck, withdrawn, and maintained his cautious solitude. Instead, he spoke from his heart in a language he barely understood, and it changed his entire world. If you enjoyed this story and want more thought-provoking science fiction tales exploring what it means to be human, or not quite human, in the vast cosmos, don't forget to subscribe to Sci-Fi Pulse. If Dylan and Ellie's story resonated with you, hit the like button and leave a comment below about how you took a risk in connecting and how it changed your life. Did it end like Dylan's beautiful accident, or did you learn something different? And don't go anywhere.